What I'm hoping on doing today is, with the display of some maps and stuff like that, we're going to talk about candle lighting in the town of Hamburg. Now, and Altona, which was two towns that were neighboring in Germany. We're going to learn a little responsa, and then what we're going to do is we're going to also talk about how halacha influences. This is as best as it's going to get, so we'll do it like this. Anyway, it's a little bit off-center, but I've never had this issue before in my life with this program. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about, is that better? All right, it's a little small. I can't help you though. Anyway, we're going to talk a little about candle lighting in the Chanuka Menora in 18th century Altona. This is a case study in religious integration and divergence between Sephardim and Ashkenazim in early modern Europe. Now, early modern period, for those of you who are familiar with the term, it's a new term that people like using to describe, let's disable this, here we go. To describe life before the modern era, which probably is the late 18th century, and after the middle of the 1400s. So we're going to talk a little about this issue of Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Now, we're going to learn it through the vehicle of a response, many response, one response, So this is a responsum written by Rabbi Yigals Sklarin Ligthing. You have actually the copy of it in front of you. You don't have to look at it right now, but just so that you know, Rabbi Yigals Sklarin Ligthing lived from 1668 to 1749, where he served as the chief rabbi of the triple community. We'll talk about what the triple community was later, of Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek between the years 1714 and 1749. So basically, for 30 years until he died, he was the chief rabbi. This is the cover page of his responsa, which you have in front of you, and this is the question. This question 17, She'ila Yud Zayin. So if you want to follow along inside, or you can just look. So this is the question 17 in English. I was asked, and he was asked this question by one of his congregants. The Sephardim are of the halachic opinion that only the Baal Habayit, the master of the house, and no one else lights Chanuka candles, as is the opinion of the Mechaber, the Shulchan Aruch Rav Yosef Karo. But we, the Ashkenazim, are of the halachic opinion of the Mapah, the glosses of Rav Moshe Isserles, that all the members of the household should light Chanuka candles daily. There is an Ashkenazi who lives in the house of a Sephardi. However, the Sephardi objects to the Ashkenazi lighting his Chanuka candles, since he is accustomed to his custom that only the Baal Bayit, namely himself, should light the Chanuka candles. Does the Sephardi have the ability to restrict the Ashkenazi from following his custom of lighting his Chanuka candles? So again, this is the question that was asked to him. He's the chief rabbi of this triple community in North Germany, Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. And it's about a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi living together. Again, the Ashkenazi is living in the Sephardi's home, and it's about the custom of Chanuka candles. Can a Sephardi who only one person lights in the home restrict an Ashkenazi who every person lights in the home from lighting his own candles? That's the question. Now, excuse me?
Are they family members?
Well, they're definitely not family members. Now, we're going to talk about why would there ever be this scenario, but I'm going to teach you a little how to study this responsum. How do you learn it? So classically, and I've seen people do this before, what they would do is they would learn the halachic discourse, the Talmud, which we will do, the commentators, Maimonides, Tosafos, the halachic works of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rapah, and then that's what they would end with there. And they would look at this question as an interesting fact. But if you use some historical facts and ask some historical questions, you can learn a lot more. Namely, why was this question being asked in the first place? Like, why is a Sephardi living in the house of an Ashkenazi? Why was an Ashkenazi living in his house? Why was it asked to this rabbi at this time? Why was it asked in this city of Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek? And then again, why is an Ashkenazi living in a Sephardi's home? And by doing this, what I hope I'm doing is, one, get a greater appreciation of the time period this responsum came out of, learn halacha, not only halacha, but some history, and to learn how the history affects the halachic process, which is what one of the commentators deal with. So just a quick understanding the basic halachic discourse. So you have in front of you a packet that says Halachic Sources. So if you want to follow along inside, you're more than welcome to. But these are the standard sources about Chanuka in the Talmud. So it comes from the Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, page 21b. And it's right smack in the middle of the page where it says Taf Reish Tanu Rabbanan. So this is the Gemara. It says Tanu Rabbanan Mitzvah Chanuka Ner Ishu Beito. The standard, the most basic way to perform the mitzvah of Chanuka is one man lights a candle per household, irrespective of the night. Meaning, if you're home, you have 20 people in your house, you have 5 people in your house, it's the 4th night, it's the 6th night, you're only lighting one candle. The next level is Mahadrin. Mahadrin means the better level. Ner L'chol Echad Ve'echad. We light one candle for each person in the house. Hold. Meaning, again, the night doesn't matter, only the number of people. And then the highest level is Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin. And here we have a famous dispute between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. Beit Shammai Omrim Yom Rishon Madlik Shmona Mikan Ve'elach Pochet V'holech. Namely, you start with 8 and go down to 1. Ubeit Hillel Omrim Yom Rishon Madlik Echad Umikan Ve'elach Mosef V'holech. And Beit Hillel has the opposite approach, that you start with 1 and go to 8. But for our purposes, we hold like Beit Hillel, that Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin is Mosif V'holech. Every day you add another candle. And this is the standard halachic section about how many candles to light. Again, the most basic level is 1 per household, irrespective of the night. The next level up, Mahadrin, is 1 candle per person in the household. And the next level is Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, the best of the best, which is 1 candle per night. Now, the question is, and here's like a little just review of what I should have done earlier. The question is Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin corresponding to the night and the number of the members of the household, or just the night? Meaning, again, you have 3 levels. Is the second level, is the third level Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, building off Mahadrin, or is it going off Ner Ishu Beito? Meaning, when to fulfill the highest level, do I light 1 candle per household, per person in the house, times the number of the night, or do I light just corresponding to the night? So this is actually a dispute. It's famous among disputes because of what comes next between the Tosafists and the Rambam. So Tosfot on the page, you have it on the side, you can follow. If you don't want to, you don't have to. It's the Tosfot Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, near L'ri. The Ri is of the opinion, de Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel, lo kaima ela aner ishu beito. The opinion, the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, meaning corresponding to the day or the night, does not go on Mahadrin, rather it only corresponds to Ner Ishu Beito. Why? Shekain Yesh Yoter Hidur, because there's more beautification of the mitzvah. De'ika Hakera, because there is recognition over the night it is. Meaning, if you have a person who has 10 people in his household and he's lighting on the 6th night of Hanukkah 60 candles, it's very difficult to know what night it is. But if I have 10 people in a household and only 1 person lights a menorah and there are 6 candles, it's very clear that it's the 6th night of Hanukkah. So that's the opinion of Tosfot. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, argues, and he says in the 4th parak, again, you have in your source packet on the 2nd page, the flip page, Maimonides argues and says, Kama neirot hu madlik b'Chanukah. How many candles do you light on Chanukah? Mitzvata she'akol bayit madlik ner echad, bein she'on she'abayit merubin, bein she'loya sham el echad. Quotes from the Talmud, the most basic performance of the mitzvah is 1 candle per household, whether there are many people or only 1 person. Hamahader, better than that. Madlik nero kaminyan anshe abayir ner lechol echad, bein anashim bein nashim. Interesting, he throws nashim in here, women, but he says that you you light based on corresponding to the number of people in the household, and then he says v'mahader yeter al zeh, to do better than this, v'osa mitzvah min hamuvchar, to do the best way to perform the mitzvah, madlik ner echad lechol echad ve'echad, you light 1 candle for every person, belayla rishon, v'mosef b'holech b'chol layla v'layla ner echad. And then every night you add 1 candle per person, meaning you multiply the night time times multiply the night times the number of people. So just to review, Tosfot says Mahadran builds off Ner Ishu Beito, only 1 set of candles in a household. The Rambam says Mahadran Mina Mahadran builds off Mahadran, namely this is a mathematical equation, I'm not good at math, but light candles corresponding to the night times, that's multiplication, number of people in the household. So that's where he comes to. So just to show you how this plays out, household of 5 on the 5th night, Tosfot says 5 candles, and the Rambam says 25 candles. This is pretty cool though, right? The presentation thing. You ever seen this before? Anyway, here we go. So that's the basic standard discourse in the commentary. So just to show you here how it plays out a little more and why this is famous is you have a dispute between the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, who was of Sephardic descent, and the Ramah, Rav Moshe Issus, who was of Ashkenazi descent. So this is in Hilchot Chanuka. This is the Siman Tuf Reish Ayin Aleph, how to light the candles, and it says, Kama Neirot Madlik Laila Rishon. How many candles you light on the first night? Madlik Echad, Mikan Ve'elech Mosef V'holech, Echad B'chol Laila Ad Shebolel Achron Yeshmona. So the Shulchan Aruch says you add 1 candle every night, and this is where he throws a line in to show just that he argues. Va'afilu im rabim b'nei bayit lo yadliku yoter. And even if you have a lot of people there, you only light 1. So whose opinion is he going like? Like the Tosafos that only light 1 candle. So this is where things get interesting. Here it's underlined. This is where things get interesting. The Ramag and the Ashkenazi decider of Halacha says in the Haggah, the comment, Yesh omrim dechol echad mibnei bayit yadlik. He says every person should light the candles. And you see here someone put this in. This was not the Ramah, but someone writes Rambam. That's the Rambam's opinion. V'chein aminag hapashut. And this is the pervasive custom in our lands. And then he goes on to say something else that's really important, but not for right now. So that's the Ramah. So what's interesting here is you find, and this is the comment of the Taz, the Turei Zav on the sign, that B'kan yesh chiddush b'minag. You have a novelty in this practice that the Sephardim noagin leketosot. The Sephardic opinion, the Shulchan Aruch seems to follow the Tosfos, that only 1 set of candles is being lit. The Ashkenazim and the Ashkenazim are like the Rambam, meaning that you're lighting multiple candles the night times the number of people. And then he throws in this line, sorry, 1 second, V'lo matzinu zeb, lo matzinu b'shar makom. We never find this anywhere. So I gave this talk a couple weeks ago, and someone came up and told me this. Just parenthetically, it's not true. There are multiple times where you find this phenomenon of the Shulchan Aruch holding like the Rambam. Just none of them are as famous as this one. That's why everyone knows it. But you do find it like a couple of times. It's rare, but it happens. I don't know if that makes a difference. But either way, so this is the basic issue here. The Shulchan Aruch seems to rule like Tosfot, 1 set of candles per household. And the Ramah seems to rule like the Rambam, the number times the number of people in the household. So now just to return to our original question, what was the original question? You have an Ashkenazi who wants to light his own set because he holds like the Ramah, living with a Sephardi who holds like the Shulchan Aruch, that only 1 person's allowed to light. So that's the halachic background to the question. But what I'm interested in is, why is this question being asked? So to do that, I'm going to give you a little background on what life was like in the city of Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek in the 18th century. So Altona and Hamburg were 2 neighboring cities on the lower Elbe River. The lower Elbe River is in North Germany. It's very close to Denmark. Here's a zoomer in. Here's the Elbe. And why the Elbe was important in Hamburg particularly was because it was a major port that led to basically the entire central Germany and Poland. So it's a major port city. It lost a lot of its importance as time went on, but it was a major city. And what's fascinating is you have these two cities that were right next to each other, Hamburg and Altona. They were neighboring. Like you could walk in one day from one to the other. But that's okay, fine, that's interesting, who cares? But what's interesting is that they had two different governments. Hamburg was an imperial free city, while Altona was a Danish principality. So if you lived in Hamburg, which is, it's like, you know, Teaneck and Englewood. I mean, that's where I'm from, so that's why I use it. Or like Riverdale and Yonkers. Well, that's actually what it's like, right? Like if you live in Riverdale, you're a resident of Manhattan, and if you're a resident of Yonkers, Bronx. Do you pay taxes to the city of Manhattan? New York City? To me, whatever. You know what I mean? If you live in the Riverdale, you pay taxes to the city of New York. If you live in Yonkers, somehow you don't have to do that, even though you pay the city of Yonkers. So, but that's not. This was unique here was that it was a different country, with different governments, and they had different rules and different citizenship. So if you can imagine, things would get complicated. If you have people. Oh, so in Germany at the time, you had certain cities that were controlled by their own government. They had their own senate. They had their own independent cities, like Frankfurt.
5, I think. The Hanseatic League.
Right.
Hamburg was part of the Hanseatic League.
There you go. Hamburg, Frankfurt. These were cities that were They were in Germany, but they were not. I guess, I don't know. They were part of it. So what's interesting here is that who started coming. So the Sephardim, and these were not professing Jews, conversos, started arriving in Hamburg in 1590s as part of a broader emigration of conversos from Portugal. I mean, you had 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain. The majority of those Jews went to Portugal. And then in 1497, they were converted against their will to Christianity and not allowed to leave. So you had this mass of Jews who were converted against their will living in Portugal, and they lived there and things were like not okay, but things were semi-okay that they could survive. But then in the 1590s, there was a new Inquisition that came, was very strong and put hard pressure on people, and people started leaving en masse to different Western European cities. The famous cities that we're familiar with, the Sephardic early Spanish Portuguese cities, were, London and Amsterdam and Venice and Livorno. These cities, New York was a little later, Curacao, Jamaica, Suriname. These cities came of this wave and subsequent waves of Sephardic conversos who were leaving. So you have these Sephardic Jews. Now these were rich merchants who were leaving, and it was because of increased pressure. And within 40 years, what's interesting here, so from 1590 to already the 1630s, they held a significant position in the Hamburg economy. Hamburg was a major center for sugarcane refinery, and Jews had a major position. Now again, when I say major, I mean like 10%. But I'm saying per quota of how much they made up the city, that's a significant number. They helped build the Hamburg Stock Exchange. Again, we're not talking here like they didn't run it, but they were a very large number based on how big they were. But when they lived in Hamburg, they were not allowed to freely practice, religion. They didn't have public prayer. They were not allowed to build synagogues. And it was always this tenuous relationship between the people in Hamburg because they weren't allowed to publicly practice Judaism. And they were let in under the premise that they would help the economy. Meaning, you have to understand this, during this time period, the city-states were hoping to build up their growth, their economic system. So they were allowing these Jews who were helping to serve them, but they never were okay with it. They weren't like, okay, well, let the Jews in. It's very liberal ideals. It wasn't like that. So eventually, things got better in Amsterdam. There were more economic greener pastures in Amsterdam, where things, the city of Amsterdam became more promising economically, religiously they were more allowed, and the city became bigger. So within 100 years, from when they started arriving in 1590s to 1690, the community hit its peak and already started declining. So again, our responsum was written between the years 1710 and in 1740. So already it's the end of the Sephardic prominence in the city. Now conversely, the Ashkenazi community of Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek was much different. The origins of the community were significantly different. The Ashkenazim who came were poorer and more religious than the Sephardic counterpart. I mean, they're more religious because the Sephardim were living as Catholics for the past 100 years. So, I mean, by definition, they're more religious. And they came as refugees from really terrible times. Like, I don't know, if I were to list top worst 50 years of Jewish history, this would be in the top of them. From 1618 to 1650s, you had terrible massacres in Poland and Lithuania, which were centers of Judaism at the time. In 1648, you had the Chmelnytsky massacres in Poland and the Ukraine. Then before that, you had the 30 Years' War in Germany, which created tremendous unrest. And then in 1654, just to add insult to injury, they say that the rivers or the lake, the seas froze over, and you had this massive invasion of Swedes into northern Poland, and they just killed a lot of people. So it's 1654. So you had thousands and thousands of Jews in the middle of the 17th century pouring into different Western European cities looking for refuge. They were not originally allowed to live in Hamburg, and they resided in Dutch Altona. The most famous person who describes these events was Glickel. You never heard of Glickel? She's famous because she's a woman and she wrote an autobiography. So her autobiography details some of the history, and it talks a lot about her. You know, we're living in Altona, we're living in Hamburg, we got kicked out of Hamburg, we're back in Altona. And she tells about how when the Muscovites came and they invaded her city in Hamburg. So she tells this story wonderfully. But that's the origin. So like,
what does it mean, Dutch Altona? Didn't you say it was Danish?
Oh, I wrote Dutch? That's a mistake. Then it's Danish. Anyway, sorry, you're right. Sorry, Danish. It can't be Dutch. You're right. Thank you very much. It's Danish. So the formation of the triple community. So what happened was the Jews wanted this is so small you can't see it. The Jews wanted to really, start consolidating their power by the end of the 1660s, the Ashkenazim, the latter half. So they started negotiation between Ashkenazi Jews of Hamburg, Altona, and Wandsbek, and they created a centralized, unified communal body for three communities referred to as the triple community. It's called, some people call it Ahu, but it's referred to as AHW in English. Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek. And this triple community really had three functions. Number one, it was a legal function, politically. The federations managed and negotiated with all the members of the Danish crown. There you go, Danish, not Dutch typos. A Danish crown. And even those Ashkenazim living in Hamburg, if they're Ashkenazi, they were considered Danish residents back in Altona. So you can imagine the political questions people had. Like, you're an Ashkenazi, you're living in Hamburg, but because you're Ashkenazi, you're part of the triple community, you're viewed as a Dane. And this created a lot of issues for people. Second, socially, it was a federation that had treasury, burial rights, freeing captives, and those type of things. And thirdly, for our purposes, also there was a chief rabbi. And the chief rabbi was in charge of the religious supervision, creating uniformity in liturgy and customs. So that's just some of the interesting things about the chief rabbis. We're going to talk about the chief rabbi and how our friend Rabbi Cheskel Katzenellenbogen, and the person we're talking about, how he came to that. So now, the chief rabbi was primarily based in Altona, but his reach was for all Ashkenazim, both in Altona and Hamburg. And I'm just going to give you like a rundown of who the rabbis were, just because it's interesting that if you see who they were and it's leading up to our subject of discussion here, it's very interesting. So, even though the chief rabbi, was based in Altona, he had religious and communal jurisdiction of Ashkenazi community. So this is just the timeline. So from 1671 to 1680, the first chief rabbi was Rav Hillel ben Naphtali Zvi, better known as the Beit Hillel. He's a famous commentator. His comments appear on the side of the Shulchan Aruch. He left in 1680 to go get a better job. Then in 1680, his replacement was Meshulam Zalman Neumark of Vienna. So, okay, now he's fine, he's a nice person. But what's interesting is what happened next. His son-in-law was a famous rabbi named Rav Zvi Ashkenazi, who's really known as the Chacham Tzvi. Now, the Chacham Tzvi claims, or his son claims, that he had been really running the show behind the scenes. I don't know if how it works in any other shul, but he claims, I was signing everything in the name of my father-in-law, I was doing everything. He really was, he put me in charge. So the minute his father-in-law died in 1706, he wanted to be put in charge. Okay, that's 1706. Then what happens in 1708, which is under the dispute why this happened, there was an internal dispute, and the chief rabbinate over the three communities was divided. It was decided that Chacham Tzvi was to serve as the rabbi of Hamburg and Wandsbek. Those are the two smaller communities. And he was to share the Altona rabbinate with Rav Moshe Zuskin Rothenberg, and they were to alternate every 6 months. I cannot imagine a more dysfunctional rabbinic setup. So this was clearly a demotion in many ways. A demotion because the triple community was three unified communities, and now he only had really 2.5. Also, he had to alternate with someone else, and he felt, he's like, I've been running the show for 10, 15 years. It should clearly be me who's in charge. So he left in 1710 and went to Amsterdam, and he didn't really have smooth sailing anywhere he went. The Chacham Tzvi, he always, controversy seemed to follow him. But it really is very interesting if you think 40 years forward. This is, again, we're fast forwarding 40 years. So 40 years later, after Rabbi Cheskel Katzenellenbogen, and the subject of our talk tonight was the chief rabbi, there was a what do you call it when two people, there was not a contest, there was not a controversy, when two people are trying out for the same job. What do you call that? I don't know, a prabba. I don't know. There were two rabbis who wanted to become the next chief rabbi of the triple community. So who were the next two rabbis who were up for discussion? One was someone named Jonathan Eibeshitz, or Yonason Eibeshitz, and the second was Rav Jacob Emden, Rav Yaakov Emden. Now, Rav Yaakov Emden's father was the Chacham Tzvi. So his grandfather had been the second chief rabbi of Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. So if you can imagine, Rav Yaakov Emden thinks he's the next in line. He's the chosen son. He thinks he should get this job. And they brought in this brilliant, world famous, the former chief rabbi of Prague, Rav Yonason Eibeshitz, who was a renowned Talmudist, Halachas, Kabbalist, to try out for the job. And he lost. Rabbi Yaakov Emden lost. And he writes in his books, he says, it's not for me. It's not for my kavod I should have been the chief rabbi, but for the Zayda, for my Zaydi, I should have been appointed it. So now, if anyone knows the basics here of these two names, should be striking. Because Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz and Rav Yaakov Emden, to hate would be a small way to describe their relationship, or tenuous would be a very kind way to describe it. They were vicious towards each other. Rabbi Yaakov Emden constantly referred to Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz as a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. And they really went at it. It was probably the biggest dispute in Europe at the time, from 1730s till the end of the 18th century, the 1800s and beyond. These two went at each other's throats. And then after Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz died, it kept going on. Rabbi Yaakov Emden would search for the followers of Yonason Eibeshitz. And it divided, really became a divisional point. And so some early historians say, again, I find this to be disparaging, but it's interesting to think. People are human. They say that their dispute really started when he lost the job to him. He said he was jealous of him. Again, I didn't say it. I'm just quoting people saying it. Again, he was jealous of him that he lost the job, and he felt that he shouldn't have lost, and that the Yonason Eibeshitz was a crypto-Sabbathian, and as a result, he never should have gotten it, and that's why he felt, in honor, the honor of the glorious city of Ahu, you have to defend we have to defend it. So that's what he did. Anyway, now going back to our discussion, in 1714, So again, in 1708, the community was split into 3 parts, but in 1714, Rabbi Cheskel Katzenellenbogen was appointed to serve as the chief rabbi of the once again united triple community. So again, this is just to reframe the whole picture here. You have a Sephardic community that's totally on the decline economically. You have Ashkenazim who came very poor and now are building themselves up with this powerful, powerful is a strong word to use to describe it, but this apparatus of Ahu with the chief rabbi who's finally got the community back together. And someone as Sephardi asks a question, can the Ashkenazi restrict me from lighting Hanukkah candles? The Ashkenazi asks the rabbi, can a Sephardi restrict me? And they were living in Altona. They weren't living in Hamburg. So his response is very interesting on multiple levels. And if we had more time, we would go through it. But one thing that's very interesting is he historicizes the practice. He says that in reality, there's no dispute between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Everyone thinks you should light multiple candles if you have the opportunity to. Candles of the night times the number of people. But the only reason that the Shulchan Aruch said you should only light one set of candles is because he was living in Israel. And in Israel, there was no anti-Semitism. Jews were allowed to light Hanukkah candles outside. And when you light Hanukkah candles outside, where do you light them? There's only one place to light them. Where? Right at the door. So you can only fit one menorah by the door. So if that's the case, only one person can light. But the Ashkenazim who are living in Poland, and I don't know if he says this or someone else, it's cold, and people hate I think he says in our terrible days when Jews can't freely practice religion by lighting a menorah outside, so in that case, they have to light inside. And once you're lighting inside, everyone has a big enough house that there's plenty of place to light. So he says, this is a historical approach to the development of halacha, which usually is not the standard for a very old religious rabbi living in the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century. You find this later amongst other rabbinic figures, but this is an early traces of using history to explain the halachic practices. This is not the standard rabbinic approach. So he basically says everyone agrees, and we live in Altona, Hamburg, where there's anti-Semitism, and we can't light outside, or we live in Altona where we can't light outside. I don't think he explains why. So therefore, we're lighting inside. Everyone, Sephardim and Ashkenazim, should be lighting a menorah, no questions asked. And everyone should light multiple menorahs inside the house. But the way he says it is so interesting that I think based on what we discussed, you gain a greater insight. So this is what he says. Again, if you want to follow along inside, it's the second page of the response, but I have it here. The halacha most definitely is in accordance with those halachic opinions who rule that every member of the household should light Hanukkah candles. Yet even if the Sephardim still do not listen to us, can you imagine 30 years earlier, I don't think he ever could have said this, and change their practices, a Sephardi does not have the right to restrict an Ashkenazi from performing our minhag that we have proven the most correct for the residents of our land. Meaning, people who live in this region, everyone, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, should be following the Ashkenazi practice based on what I said, and he has to listen to us. Again, first of all, we didn't address why was there an Ashkenazi living in a Sephardi's home. So the reason was because Ashkenazim were so poor that they only one of the only jobs they originally could get in Hamburg and sometimes Altona was as the servant or someone living in the home to help. Whether you would live it they were sugarcane manufacturers, a lot of the Sephardim, but they didn't work the sugarcane. They would hire people to do it. So you'd have Jews living in your house who were your workers. So again, the Ashkenazi is much lower socially on a socioeconomic plane than the Ashkenazi, than the Sephardi. But still, at this point in time, the Ashkenazim are gaining a little confidence that they can say this. But the next thing is even crazier. So this is where really you get an insight into what was life like for a Sephardim before Ashkenazim came. You know, imagine this, just like if you can take a mental picture, you're coming off the boat from Portugal or you haven't been able to practice freely as a Jew. You show up in a beautiful city like Hamburg. You're not sure, should I come out I'm Jewish? Should I say I'm still a Catholic? You know, it's not so easy to make a decision. So we've always, and myself included, have thought that they arrived in these places, they proudly announced their Jewishness, they reverted back to all the practices. But so it's hard to know exactly because either side is going to be biased. But look at how the Rav Cheskel Katzenellenbogen describes it. He says, and that which the Sephardi contested, that because of the violation of lo titgodedu, again, we're not going to talk about it. Lo titgodedu means you can't have multiple practices taking place. The Ashkenazi cannot light his own Hanukkah candles. This is nonsense. Now, this is the part where I want you to see. In the community of Hamburg, where the Sephardim arrived prior to the Ashkenazim, the Sephardim, did not light any Hanukkah candles. And this is a quote from Sefer Shmuel. Until the Lord brought it to be that the Sephardim, began to settle in Altona. Meaning, in Hamburg, were they openly Jewish? No. But in Altona, when they arrived, and you have this group of Ashkenazim who are religious and fervent and publicly okay, and only then did they begin to make the efforts to bring the fear of the Lord into their heart. Meaning, if it wasn't for the Ashkenazim, the Sephardim wouldn't be lighting Hanukkah candles anyway. So even though you were here before us, you never were practicing. So that's what he argues. Now, again, if you were just to have read this, you would have either thought, like, okay, it's true, and again, I don't know if it's not true, but what's interesting is to understand the perspective of the Sephardic community is on a major decline by the time this is written, and the Ashkenazim are on their way up. And there's always this contentious relationship between the two communities. So the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi writing this is interesting. So he concludes the Ashkenazi could light candles in his own house, and the Sephardi should be okay with that. So what I wanted to show you is, for just in a quick sentence, quick brief analysis, is how these two communities lived alongside each other. And it wasn't always pleasant. Oftentimes it was contentious because of the fact that they had their own pride in themselves. Meaning, if you imagine, I guess something to imagine, you can think about it. You're a Sephardi coming from Portugal. You've risked your life. You've given up everything because of, practice Judaism. You have so much pride in your own religious existence that you don't want, you think you're, and also they were socially more wealthier. So they're looking down on the Ashkenazim, and you actually find that fascinatingly in Amsterdam, the community of Amsterdam, that was the biggest of the Sephardic, former converso communities, they actually tried sending Ashkenazim away to the New World because they were a burden on the community economically. They couldn't afford to keep them there. So there's some interesting other encounters. There's one about the Chacham Tzvi himself writes about, can Ashkenazi use a Sephardic Sefer Torah? And one of the most interesting ones is, let's say you have a Sephardi who was unhappy with where he was. He didn't like the community. Can he join the Ashkenazi community? So we don't even think in these terms, but these two communities lived side by side, yet were very different. And another interesting thing the responsive brings out is historicizing halacha, which is really a later phenomena. Like, I remember, you don't really find this among standard rabbinic approaches. The Maritz Chias, or Tzvi Hirsch, it was like 100 years later, he's one of the first modern rabbis who starts historicizing. You don't find it earlier times than this, which I just think is interesting. So based on this presentation, I just wanted to show you that you look at a responsum like this, and you read it, you could see that there's so much beneath it. It's like an iceberg. Anyway, this is my spiel for tonight. I just wanted you to see a little bit about how you can learn a tremendous amount from one halachic responsum about these two communities. Thank you very much. Any questions? I know we like questions. Yes, sure.
Are we going to go back to religious and scientific encounters?
Oh, that's next week. We're going to go, sorry to disappoint. I don't know if this was disappointing or not, but next week we're going to talk a little about how different religious people reacted to the dinosaur, the age of the universe, in terms of age of the world with geological discoveries, including dinosaurs. We'll look at some Catholic theologians and some Jewish rabbis who said the same thing. So that's what we're going to talk a little about. Any other questions about this? Yeah, question.
Were the different communities different Christian sects? It was one Protestant. Germany was mostly Protestant.
Right.
But northern Germany, I think, was Catholic.
I think.
Northern Germany was Protestant. The Catholics were in the south.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly. Right, Amsterdam was much more liberal. I mean, it was much more liberal, Amsterdam. But even in Amsterdam, when the Jews originally got there, they weren't like welcomed with open arms. Amsterdam was much more liberal, but I don't remember. I don't remember offhand. I know that the clergy in Hamburg had a real control over the Senate. The Senate had two major parties. One was the clergy, and one was the merchants. And they were often fighting with each other. And if you trace the enactments against anti-Jewish enactments, it's interesting to see based on who's in control. Because the clergy and the lower class often were aligned against the merchants who wanted to allow Jews in, who were much more liberal. So if you follow those two, you can see a little bit of it. But I don't remember offhand. I don't know. Yes?
Well, I mean, it wasn't really relevant to the discussion, but you glossed over one thing.
Sure.
The Rambam is not the same as the Ramah.
Oh, for sure.
Because the Rambam has,
right.
even for Mahadrim and Ahadrim, there's only one person left.
Right, right.
Whereas the Ramah says each individual should have his own menorah, which is something totally different.
100%. I didn't address...
so what the Taz says, that here we follow
right,
the Rambam.
Right. You know, later commentators have all tried, like the Aruch HaShulchan, other people have all addressed this point. I didn't get into it because he doesn't think that way. He follows the Taz's understanding. I mean, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's clear that the person who wrote Rambam was not the Ramah. He has a different opinion. Who did? That I don't know. Well, I'm sure I mean, you have to ask someone who follows the editions of the Shulchan Aruch.
And one other point, because the way he wanted to explain, because in Eretz Yisrael they didn't have room, but the Mechaber says, he just says, do one, then the second night two, and then he says, V'lo yadliku yosef.
Right.
If it was just for convenience, he didn't have to say lo
yadliku yosef. Right. And he actually says that the Rambam, you know, even though the Rambam lived in Spain, he was living in tumultuous times, as everyone knows, so he was lighting inside. That's what the Knesset Yechezkel argues. I mean, I agree with you. This is not the standard, more practical way of reading it. I agree with you 100%. I'm just, you know, when I teach this to my own students, I teach it more like the way you were saying, but that's what he says. So, I don't know. Anyway, yes, question?
Let me go back to something else. You were talking about the role of Spanish Jews in sugar.
Right.
Now, they certainly were not processing sugar in Europe because the sugar cane was grown in the Caribbean.
Right, but then they
what were they doing with it?
I thought they were I think they took the sugar cane from the Caribbean.
No, they processed it in the Caribbean. So it either came back as refined sugar or it came back as molasses.
Can they turn refined sugar into molasses?
I'm sorry, no, molasses is a lower quality.
I know that they had the sugar cane plantations in the Caribbean, and then they were bringing it and doing something with it, refining it in Europe, because they didn't have the technology.
They couldn't have been. You know, it was this triangle. It was the rum, slave.
Right, but this was, I think.
I just raised it because there may have been a commodities exchange, and raw sugar was coming in. Processed sugar, molasses was coming in, and so on. But they were not processing it.
I don't, and I'm not a sugar cane expert, so I don't know. That's.
You will be for the next lecture.
Right. That's what in all the secondary literature I've read, that's what they say. But I don't know what that means. Meaning, again, you might be right. I don't know. They might be wrong. But whatever it is, the plantations.
They were growing it there.
They were definitely growing it there. I know that, and the Caribbean.
That's why there was such a major importation of slaves because.
Right. No, that I know, but so I don't know what happened with it when it left there. And something happened when it got to Hamburg that the Jews were involved in. I don't know if it was selling. Right, they might have been trading it. I'm not sure, but either way, that's what it says. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Wasn't Ellenbogen a Ashkenazi?
He was an Ashkenazi, exactly. That's why he's writing against the Sephardi in very negative terms. But he was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi when the Sephardim were on their way down. They did not have a chief rabbi, no. They did not, there were some famous Sephardi rabbis who came out of Hamburg, but they did not have an official, I don't think they had a strong official position.
Talking
like
about Sephardim and Ashkenazim, how come Chacham Tzvi was an Ashkenazi?
Right, so that's a very good point. He lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there was Sephardim there, so he took on the accolade Chacham, and that's why he felt he was best served as the chief rabbi of Amsterdam, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, because he knew the Sephardim so well. You have another example.
In Hamburg, Chacham Bernays.
Right, that's the other example was Bernays, right? But he also was right. He just liked the Chacham.
They say he called himself Chacham because at that time the reform started.
And they were all rabbis.
They were rabbis, and he wanted to say, I'm one of them.
Exactly right. So the Chacham Tzvi says the story that he got the name when he actually was traveling through Serbia, yeah, and he was traveling through, and he became friends with the Sephardim, and he picked up the name because he liked it, and he kept it. I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. Next week we'll learn more about dinosaurs.
And what about the New World?
The New World, I don't know if